The halls of Parliament buzzed with anticipation. It had been days of intense discussion, heated debates, and careful scrutiny of every financial decision shaping Singapore's future. Now, all eyes were on Finance Minister Lawrence Wong as he stepped up to the podium, ready to deliver his final remarks on Budget 2025. The room fell silent. This was the moment lawmakers, businesses, and everyday Singaporeans had been waiting for, an explanation of how the nation's spending plans would impact lives, jobs, and the economy in the years ahead. From the very start, Budget 2025 had been a balancing act, ensuring stability while addressing new challenges in a fast-changing world. Rising costs of living, global economic uncertainties, and the need to strengthen social support were just some of the pressing issues on the table. Every policy proposed had sparked debate, with different voices weighing in on what mattered most to the people. Some praised the government's strategic planning, while others questioned whether enough was being done for middle-income families and businesses still recovering from past economic shocks. As Lawrence Wong adjusted his microphone, he knew this speech wasn't just about numbers and projections, it was about trust. How well had the government listened to the concerns raised? Were there enough measures to ease the financial strain on households? What new strategies would be put in place to secure Singapore's long-term future? The answers to these questions would shape public confidence and set the tone for the months ahead. His eyes swept across the chamber, where members of Parliament sat with pens in hand, ready to react. Some nodded in quiet agreement, while others remained skeptical, waiting for clear justifications. Outside these walls, millions of Singaporeans tuned in, eager to hear how this budget would affect their daily lives, whether it meant better housing affordability, improved healthcare support, or stronger job security. Then, in a steady and assured voice, Lawrence Wong began. He started by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised throughout the debate, offering clarity on the government's stance. But as he laid out the final conclusions, there were still lingering questions. Would this budget truly be enough to safeguard Singapore's economy? Had all the difficult choices been made, or were tougher times still ahead? Stay with us as we dive into his full speech, every key announcement, every response to the tough questions, and what it all means for Singapore's future. Lawrence Wong took a measured breath before continuing. His tone was calm but firm, every word carefully chosen. This wasn't just another speech, it was a response to the growing concerns Singaporeans had voiced over the past weeks. He knew that expectations were high, and the choices made in this budget will affect families, businesses, and the country's future for years to come. He started by addressing the elephant in the room, the rising cost of living. It was a topic that had dominated the debate, with MPs pressing for more support for lower and middle-income families. Prices of essentials had gone up, and people were feeling the strain. Would the government step in further? Would there be additional relief measures beyond what had already been announced? Some in the chamber leaned forward, waiting for his next words, hoping for a breakthrough. Then came the discussion on jobs and economic stability. The world was changing fast, and Singapore needed to stay ahead. Wong outlined the government's vision, investing in new industries, upskilling workers, and ensuring businesses remained competitive. But not everyone was convinced. Some MPs had argued that more needed to be done to protect local jobs, especially for those struggling to adapt to automation and shifting global trends. The finance minister acknowledged these concerns, but was his plan enough? Or would more Singaporeans find themselves left behind in an increasingly digital economy? Another point of contention was social support. Over the past few days, MPs had raised questions about whether the budget truly addressed the needs of the aging population, young families, and those facing unexpected hardships. Housing, healthcare, education, these were the pillars of a secure life, and many wondered if the government's measures were ambitious enough. Wong reiterated the importance of long-term planning, emphasizing that sustainability was key. But in a time of uncertainty, was a gradual approach enough, or did Singaporeans need bolder, more immediate solutions? As he spoke, the mood in Parliament remained mixed. Some members nodded in agreement, while others scribbled notes, preparing their final responses. Outside the chamber, Singaporeans were having their own debates. Social media was flooded with opinions. Some praised the government's careful planning, while others questioned whether it had done enough to address immediate struggles. The tension wasn't just in Parliament, it was across the nation. Wong's speech was far from over, and the most critical points were still to come. Would he reveal additional support measures? Would there be unexpected policy shifts? And most importantly, would this budget truly deliver on its promise of security and progress? The answers were just moments away. The atmosphere in Parliament remained charged as Lawrence Wong continued. He was no stranger to these debates. He had defended budgets before, but this time, the stakes felt higher. Every decision carried weight. The cost of living crisis, economic uncertainty, and shifting global markets had put the government under intense pressure. People weren't just asking for help, they were demanding change. As he spoke, he reinforced the government's strategy: long-term resilience, sustainable growth, and targeted support. But for some, these assurances weren't enough. The opposition had been vocal throughout the debate, arguing that more direct relief was needed now, not later. Why not introduce more immediate subsidies? Why not expand social assistance programs further? The finance minister acknowledged these concerns, but he remained firm. Singapore's approach had always been about balance, not quick fixes. Would this patience pay off, or would it push struggling families further to the edge? Beyond the opposition, there were voices from within the ruling party itself that had pushed for adjustments. Some MPs, particularly those representing lower-income districts, had urged for stronger measures to cushion inflation's impact. They had listened to their constituents: families cutting back on essentials, young couples delaying home ownership, seniors worrying about medical costs. These MPs understood the numbers in the budget, but they also saw the reality on the ground. Wong had to reassure them too. He had to prove that this budget wasn't just about policies, it was about people. Then came the issue of businesses. The government had announced measures to support small and medium enterprises, encouraging innovation and job creation. But some business owners had raised concerns. Rising operational costs, labor shortages, and global competition made survival difficult. They weren't just looking for grants or tax relief, they wanted structural reforms. Could the government do more to ease the burden? Would Singapore's pro-business stance remain strong in an increasingly protectionist world? And in the background of all these discussions was an even bigger question: what would Singapore's future look like? Beyond the immediate challenges, there were deeper shifts at play. Climate change, an aging population, technological disruption. These weren't just distant concerns. They were realities shaping the economy. Wong spoke of transformation, of preparing for what was ahead. But some wondered, was this budget bold enough? Was it preparing Singapore for a future that was coming faster than expected? As his speech continued, the tension in the room grew. Some MPs exchanged glances, sensing that key announcements were still to come. Outside, Singaporeans were glued to their screens, waiting to see if their worries would be addressed. The finance minister had laid out the challenges, explained the government's vision, but had he truly answered the most pressing questions? The final moments of his speech would be crucial. The air of the chamber felt heavier now. Every word Lawrence Wong spoke carried weight. Every pause stretched the anticipation further. He had spent the last hour laying out the government's vision, carefully justifying decisions, addressing concerns, and outlining the path forward. But he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The questions that remained unspoken were often the most pressing. Would this budget truly ease the struggles people were feeling? Was it bold enough to safeguard Singapore's future? As he reached the final stretch of his speech, he took a moment to acknowledge the unease many Singaporeans felt. He spoke about the uncertainty in the global economy, how rising geopolitical tensions and supply chain disruptions were putting pressure on markets. He warned that economic resilience wasn't built overnight, that tough choices had to be made to ensure long-term stability. But outside the walls of Parliament, Singaporeans weren't just thinking about long-term strategy. They were thinking about their daily lives. Parents worried about affording tuition fees. Seniors wondered if their retirement savings would last. Young workers questioned if they would ever afford a home. Inside the chamber, some MPs shifted in their seats, sensing that something big was coming. Would Wong announce additional relief measures? Was there still room for last-minute changes? Opposition members sat with pens in hand, ready to challenge his final statements. Business leaders, economists, and everyday citizens watched from their screens, waiting for the defining moment of this speech. The tension was building, and it felt like something had to give. Then came the most pressing topic: taxes and government revenue. The finance minister had defended the planned adjustments, arguing that they were necessary for Singapore's long-term sustainability. But many had pushed back. Why raise taxes now, when people were already struggling? Was there truly no other way? Wong maintained that careful fiscal planning was key to avoiding long-term debt traps, but the murmurs in the chamber suggested that not everyone was convinced. If the cost burden grew heavier, how would the government ensure that ordinary citizens weren't left behind? Every line of his speech now carried an unspoken challenge. Some MPs listened with cautious optimism, trusting the government's strategy. Others exchanged skeptical glances, mentally preparing their final counter-arguments. Even outside Parliament, discussions were intensifying, on social media, in coffee shops, at dinner tables. People were debating what this budget truly meant for them, for their families, for the nation as a whole. As Wong prepared to deliver his final points, the tension had reached its peak. The entire nation was waiting to see if this budget would truly deliver, waiting to hear the final words that could sway opinions. And then, with a deep breath, he began his closing remarks. Just as Lawrence Wong was about to deliver his closing remarks, a ripple of movement spread through the chamber. A member of the opposition stood up, signaling for an intervention. The tension in the room thickened. This was unexpected. The finance minister paused, allowing the moment to unfold. The MP's voice was steady but firm as they questioned one of the most debated points of the budget: whether the measures outlined truly did enough for those feeling the sharpest effects of inflation. The challenge was clear. Wong had reassured Singaporeans that support would be targeted and sustainable, but to some, it wasn't enough. The opposition pressed on, arguing that while the government's long-term strategy was sound, immediate relief was still lacking for families struggling to make ends meet. Was there any room left in the budget for urgent adjustments? Could more be done without compromising fiscal discipline? Around the room, MPs leaned in, sensing the stakes had just been raised even higher. The finance minister listened carefully. He had expected pushback, but this moment had the potential to shift the entire conversation. For a brief second, the chamber felt like a battlefield. Every word and decision could tip public opinion in a different direction. Was he about to make a concession? Would there be an unexpected last-minute policy shift? The anticipation in the room was palpable. Outside Parliament, the debate was just as intense. Across the country, Singaporeans were watching live, reacting in real time. Some felt that the government had done enough to manage resources responsibly, ensuring the country's future remained stable. Others believed there was still a gap, one that required a stronger response from the nation's leadership. Social media was flooded with contrasting views, each side making their case with passion. The budget had become more than just a policy discussion. It had turned into a national conversation about fairness, security, and the future. Wong finally responded. His voice was composed, but there was a noticeable shift in tone. He acknowledged the concerns, reaffirming that the government was always willing to adapt and listen. He didn't dismiss the opposition's point. He took it seriously. But then, in a surprising turn, he hinted at a possible reconsideration of some measures. Was this an opening for further revisions? Was the government preparing for additional support? The speech was reaching its most critical point, but nothing was settled yet. The finance minister had shown a willingness to engage, but the real question remained: what would happen next? The answer wasn't clear, and the nation was left hanging on his every word. The chamber was silent for a moment, the weight of Lawrence Wong's words hanging in the air. His response had been measured, careful, but the hint of a possible adjustment to the budget had sent shockwaves through the room. Had the government just signaled a shift in its approach? Was this a rare moment where public pressure had nudged policy a new direction? The opposition MP who had raised the challenge sat back, watching closely, knowing that this moment was far from over. Then, in a move no one had fully expected, Wong turned to address not just Parliament but the entire nation. His tone remained firm, but now there was an undeniable urgency in his words. He acknowledged the deep anxieties that had surfaced during the debate, the worries of families stretching their incomes, businesses struggling to stay afloat, and seniors uncertain about their financial security. And then, with quiet resolve, he made an announcement that sent a ripple through the room. There would be additional support measures, not a complete overhaul, not a dramatic reversal, but targeted enhancements in key areas. More direct assistance for lower-income families, additional financial relief for businesses navigating economic uncertainties, a recalibrated approach to ensure that while long-term stability remained the goal, immediate concerns weren't ignored. It wasn't a concession, it was a strategic adjustment, one that balanced the country's needs with the reality of the present. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a wave of reaction. Some MPs nodded in approval, recognizing the government's willingness to adapt. Others remained skeptical, wondering if these measures would truly be enough. But the mood had shifted. Outside Parliament, Singaporeans watching the speech saw something rare, an evolving response in real time. Some took to social media, praising the move as a necessary show of leadership. Others debated whether it had come too late or if more was still needed. And just when it seemed like the climax had passed, Wong added one final twist. He spoke of an upcoming mid-year review, a structured opportunity to reassess economic conditions and make further adjustments if needed. It was an implicit acknowledgement that the world was changing too fast for any budget to be set in stone. The government was leaving room for flexibility, for adaptation. It was a calculated decision, one that ensured this budget wasn't just about the present, but remained responsive to the future. With that, Wong concluded his speech. The tension in the room didn't dissipate completely, but there was a shift. A new phase of discussion was beginning. This budget debate had been more than just policymaking. It had been a defining moment, one that tested the government's ability to balance principle with practicality. As the chamber moved toward its final deliberations, one thing was certain: the conversation was far from over. As Lawrence Wong stepped away from the podium, the atmosphere in Parliament remained charged. The debate had been intense, the stakes had been high, and the direction of Singapore's future had been openly challenged. But as MPs reflected on the speech, there was a sense that something significant had happened, not just another budget announcement, but a moment of real engagement, where the voices of the people had been heard. Outside the chamber, the response was immediate. News outlets rushed to break down the last-minute adjustments. Economists analyzed the long-term implications, and everyday Singaporeans weighed in with their thoughts. Some felt reassured, believing that the government's willingness to adapt showed strength and pragmatism. Others remained unconvinced, skeptical about whether these changes would truly ease financial pressures. The debate wasn't over. It had simply moved beyond the walls of Parliament, into homes, workplaces, and social media feeds across the country. In the following days, analysts would continue to dissect the speech, tracking how markets reacted and whether public sentiment shifted. Businesses would assess how the revised measures would impact them, while families recalibrated their budgets, factoring in the new support schemes. The mid-year review promised by Wong became a focal point. What would change by then? Would the government be willing to make further adjustments if economic conditions worsened? These lingering questions ensured that while the budget had been passed, the conversation about Singapore's financial future was still very much alive. But perhaps the most important takeaway from this debate was not just about numbers or policies. It was about trust. The willingness to acknowledge concerns, the commitment to adapt, and the promise to stay responsive had left a lasting impression. Governance wasn't about having all the answers up front. It was about listening, responding, and making decisions that balanced both present needs and future stability. As Singaporeans moved forward, one thing was clear: this budget was more than a financial plan. It was a reflection of the evolving relationship between the government and its people, a reminder that leadership is measured not just by policies, but by the ability to navigate uncertainty with resilience and accountability.